Lincoln had expected McClellan to follow after Lee, striking hard while the Confederate forces were still reeling from their losses at Antietam and were still far from home. Lincoln visited McClellan at his headquarters near Antietam in the first week of October. At that point, the Army of the Potomac had sat still for over 2 weeks. He urged McClellan then to pursue the enemy quickly while the time was right. But McClellan did not move. Lincoln followed his visit with telegrams that continued to push McClellan to take action. He instructed his general-in-chief, Henry Halleck, to order McClellan to cross the Potomac and give battle. But McClellan did not move. Finally, on November 7th, Lincoln removed McClellan from command, replacing him with General Ambrose Burnside. But though McClellan did not achieve the level of success that Lincoln believed possible, the end of the Northern invasion and Lee's retreat to Virginia did give Lincoln the opportunity he needed for something else. In the North, abolitionist pressure was building for a general emancipation of all slaves. Lincoln knew that he would need a substantial Union military victory first, or else the move would seem like an act of desperation, and therefore might draw more resistance than support in the North. Lincoln also feared what emancipation efforts would do to the support of the border states. On multiple occasions, he met with delegates from these states in an attempt to get them to accept some process of gradual emancipation whereby the federal government would financially reimburse slave owners for their loss of property. But the offer was flatly refused. Months earlier, Congress was able to force the issue in the District of Columbia. In April 1862, about a year after the war began, Congress abolished slavery in the district and compensated former slave owners with payments of $300 per slave. It was the beginning of emancipation in America. Even in the North, there was resistance to the idea of large numbers of free blacks intermingling with whites. White workers feared the competition they might face, competing against workers whose experience was to labor without pay. Racist fears dovetailed with economic ones, as foes of emancipation warned of black men taking up with the daughters of white men. Anti-slavery forces resisted this backlash and stressed that emancipation would help the war effort. Lincoln, as ever, sought to preserve the Union. As he said,
"My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. And what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union. I shall do less whenever I shall believe what I am doing hurts the cause, and I shall do more whenever I shall believe doing more will help the cause."
But even as he said this, Lincoln had been making plans to take action on emancipation using the war powers granted to the commander-in-chief. He just needed that military victory. Antietam provided that victory, and on September 22, 1862, Lincoln issued a proclamation which declared that all slaves living in states that were in rebellion as of January 1, 1863, would be free. Slaves living in the border states of Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri were not included in Lincoln's proclamation, nor were those living in Confederate states, but within areas controlled by the Union. But this still meant that over 3 million slaves had been freed under the law by the stroke of a pen. Lincoln said at the time,
"I never in my life felt more certain that I was doing right than I do in signing this paper."
Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation changed the political nature of the war. Before, Lincoln might have accepted the peaceful return of the Confederate states and allowed them to retain their constitutions and their slaves. But now, No peace could be made without the South surrendering its slaves or the Union surrendering its states. While the Army of the Potomac was fighting off Robert E. Lee's invasion of Maryland in the east, the Union's Army of the Ohio was battling against a Confederate invasion of Kentucky in the west. Confederate General Braxton Bragg had led his Army of the Mississippi into Kentucky in August 1862. Like Lee, Bragg hoped to draw support from Confederate sympathizers in this border state. He also sought to draw Union Major General Don Carlos Buell out of Tennessee. Buell had reinforced General Grant at Shiloh in April and later participated in the month-long siege of Corinth, Mississippi in May. He then began a slow march toward Chattanooga, Tennessee. Bragg found in Kentucky what Lee found in Maryland. Whatever sympathies the border states might have toward the Confederacy, they were not enough to deliver Bragg the men he hoped to recruit. But Bragg did succeed in drawing Buell out of Tennessee. On October 7th, Buell's Army of the Ohio clashed with Bragg's forces at Perryville, Kentucky. After smaller skirmishes on the 7th, fighting began in earnest on the 8th. A Union division assaulted the Confederate line near Peters Hill. A Confederate division struck the Union's left flank, forcing it back. As more Confederate divisions joined in the assault, the Union line was forced back. Some of the Union units were in full rout, but the commanders were able to stabilize the line, forcing the Confederates to a halt. John Beatty, who was commissioned as a brigadier general in the 3rd Ohio Infantry for his performance at Perryville, wrote in his journal that day,
"Nearly 200 of my 500 men now lay dead and wounded on the little strip of ground over which we fought. They have long sought for a battle and often been disappointed and sore because they failed to find one. But now, for the first time, they really realize what a battle is. They see it is to men what an Arctic wind is to autumn leaves, and are astonished to find that any have outlived the furious storm of deadly missiles. The enemy is in the woods before us, and as the sentinels occasionally exchange shots, we can see the flash of their guns and hear the whistle of bullets above our heads. The two armies are too near to sleep comfortably or even safely, so the boys cling to their muskets and keep ready for action. It is a long night, but it finally comes to an end."
Union forces took 4,200 casualties at Perryville, and the Confederates took 3,200. As with Antietam, at Perryville, the Confederates could point to their ability to stand up to a larger force and inflict more casualties than they received. In truth, however, the Battle of Perryville was a tactical stalemate, and it was a strategic victory for the Union. As with Lee's Maryland invasion, Bragg's Heartland offensive into Kentucky was shut down, and his army retreated to Tennessee. Buell, like McClellan, failed to follow his enemy and strike quickly in East Tennessee as Lincoln had wished. Lincoln removed Buell from command. The Union's western forces were reorganized, and Buell's Army of the Ohio was folded into the new Department of the Cumberland under Major General William Rosecrans. In the east, General Burnside had replaced McClellan as the commander of the Army of the Potomac. Although Burnside had distinguished himself in a few earlier operations, he did not believe himself ready for command of the full army. But when told that the commander would be either him or his rival, Joe Hooker, he reluctantly accepted the post. Burnside immediately demonstrated that he was willing to seek the fights that McClellan would not. He planned a bold, fast march to Fredericksburg, Virginia. There, he would cross the Rappahannock River and then advance along the railroad line to Richmond. He was positioned to get there ahead of Lee, cutting the rebel general off from his main base of operations. The Army of the Potomac set out on November 15th, and within 2 days, Burnside's advance elements reached the north side of the Rappahannock. The Confederates had long since destroyed the bridges across the river. Burnside's plan called for pontoon bridges to be quickly sent to the front and assembled for the army, now 120,000 strong, to cross. This is where Burnside's plan fell apart. A series of administrative failures delayed the bridges for 17 days. more than enough time for Lee to arrange his forces. Lee's artillery and infantry were dug in. Crossing the Rappahannock would be a bloody affair. Burnside arranged his forces into 3 grand divisions. Major General Edwin Sumner commanded the right Grand Division, Major General Joseph Hooker the center, and Major General William Franklin the left. Each division included 2 corps of infantry plus cavalry. Confederate Lieutenant General James Longstreet later recounted,
"On the morning of the 11th of December, 1862, an hour or so before daylight, the slumbering Confederates were awakened by a solitary cannon thundering on the heights of Marye's Hill. The aroused Confederates recognized the signal of the Washington artillery and knew that the Federal troops were preparing to cross the Rappahannock. Until 1 o'clock this contest lasted, when the Federals, with angry desperation, turned their whole force of artillery on the little city and sent down from the heights a perfect storm of shot and shell, crushing the houses with a cyclone of fiery metal. From our position on the heights, we saw the batteries hurling an avalanche upon the town, whose only offense was near its edge in a snug retreat, nestled 3,000 Confederate hornets that were stinging the Army of the Potomac into a frenzy. But in the midst of all this fury, the little brigade of Mississippians clung to their work. At last, when I had everything in readiness, I sent a peremptory order to Barksdale to withdraw, which he did, fighting as he retired before the Federals, who had by that time succeeded in landing a number of their troops.
Sumner's division secured the town of Fredericksburg and then looted it, smashing whatever they could find in the abandoned homes. On the 13th, Union troops began their attack on the Confederate line. On the left, south of the town, Franklin's division was stopped short by Stonewall Jackson's artillery. On the right, Hooker's divisions had to cross a sunken road and a mile of open ground to capture Marye's Heights. Longstreet commanded the defense there.
This was just where we had expected to attack, and I was prepared to meet it. As the troops massed before us, they were very much annoyed by the fire of our batteries. The field was literally packed with Federals from the vast number of troops that had been massed in the town. From the moment of their appearance began the most fearful carnage. With our artillery from the front, right, and left tearing through their ranks, the Federals pressed forward with almost invincible determination, maintaining their steady step and closing up their broken ranks. Thus resolutely they marched upon the stone fence behind which they quietly waited the Confederate brigade of General Cobb. As they came within reach of this brigade, a storm of lead was poured into their advancing ranks, and they were swept away from the field like chaff before the wind.
Union troops made 7 charges at the Marye's Heights, all resulting in the same terrible result.
When night came to end the dreadful carnage, and the Federals withdrew, leaving the battlefield literally heaped with the bodies of their dead. Before the well-directed fire of Cobb's brigade, the Federals had fallen like a steady dripping of rain from the eaves of our house. Our musketry alone killed and wounded at least 5,000, and these, with the slaughter by the artillery, left over 7,000 killed and wounded before the foot of Marye's Hill. The dead were piled sometimes 3 deep, and when morning broke, the spectacle that we saw upon the battlefield was one of the most distressing I ever witnessed.
Union casualties were staggering. Almost 12,700 men, including 1,300 killed and 9,600 wounded. Lee's Army of Virginia suffered less than half those losses. Burnside withdrew his forces across the river, his advance toward Richmond thwarted.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.